and said we want things to change. So I really have no time for these conspiracy theories. No doubt some people who were using Facebooks and the social networks were pro-American, but so what? What they were demanding effectively was a change in a system in which it lost confidence, a change in the regime. And this mood spread all over. And it's the interventions which have made it much worse. Now people are scared to come out all over. I mean, look what happened in Libya. Look what happened in Syria. Because they didn't want things to get out of control, so they intervened. They linked up with the United States and the West, in particular in Libya and in Syria, with people who they couldn't control. In Iraq, with people who they can't control. I mean, the first state visit to the Green Zone in Baghdad was made by Ahmadinejad, the big enemy of the United States, then president. He made a state visit and the Iraqi regime, protected by US troops, welcomed him. So they can't always control what they do, and it's better not to intervene. That's the lesson they should learn, but they don't learn it. But the one thing that can also happen in a country, let's talk just briefly about this country, is that you have democracy, and democracy, of course, being what it is as a system, especially when people are excited about it in the first stages of it, produces a result which not everyone likes. And one has to get used to that. Now, what happened in this country? I mean, I certainly wouldn't myself have voted for the Brotherhood. I've never been their supporter. I would have voted for Sabahi or I don't know, certainly not Shafiq. So, but I would have cast my vote since I had not been given a chance to vote ever before. Vote properly. I don't mean these joke elections where 99.9% vote for a leader. So it was exciting. Then a leader is elected who's very disappointing for many people, and who's not very bright either, which didn't help. It really did not help, because an intelligent leader, an intelligent leadership of the Brotherhood, in my opinion, would have gone not for their own candidate, knowing how divisive they are, and some of them knew it, but gone for Baradei or someone else who represented the movement as a whole and could have managed the country in this difficult time, a transition to something more normal. They didn't do it. And then we saw a turnaround, and we saw people panicking, and when people panicked, they came back to the one institution which, they felt was, why they felt this, because of history partially, belonged to them, and opted for a military again. And, it's not that people haven't been killed by this force. And when you see what the judiciary is now up to, 600 people being tried and sentenced to death, for God's sake, this is a complete joke. If you want to at least convince people that these people are guilty, you have to allow proper trials with defense lawyers. You can pass the same judgment, but let people see it at least, and give the charged people a chance to. It's not happening. So I'm fearful. I'll be blunt with you. I am fearful. I think this is going to end badly. And I think people will now, ordinary people, not people who are sort of activists will feel that nothing changes. We sacrificed lives, we came out, we got rid of Mubarak, and now what? So best to stay at home and just try and find a way to eat 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day or 1 meal a day, hope our children get some education and not do anything. That is my fear. Because the interesting thing about these uprisings in the Arab world is how people from every single social layer in society joined them. And that, I think, is now under threat. And never ever mistake the wishes and desires of activists or people like myself or many in this room as something which is reflected in the population as a whole. Because traditionally, throughout history, whenever you have uprisings, increase the political consciousness of the people, and this political consciousness can reach a peak. If the time when it reaches a peak, nothing happens at all, or something happens which is disappointing, it comes down very quickly. Political consciousness in the masses is never something that rises step by step by step by step. It never does. Nothing would change if it did. It comes very sharp and sudden, and then it can come very down again, and the next time it goes up again is up for grabs. We don't know. But it doesn't help any of this if the system that people in the rest of the world perceive now existing in the West is increasingly moving towards forms of authoritarianism, and I use the word very carefully, and is reaching the level of a farce. Europe, from that point of view, leave alone the United States, does not offer a positive image to a democracy which activates, which permits self-activity to its citizens, which encourages this self-activity. This I've only seen in South America, by the way. These forms of self-activity, citizen participation, including in parts of Brazil, but certainly in many of the Bolivarian states. This we have not seen in Europe, and all the indications are that it is, we are not going to see it. Peter Mayer in his book gives statistics over the last 10 years of declining participation in elections in the whole of Western Europe. So even the big victories that have been won often with the participation of a popular vote that is in decline. The Labour leader who was defeated by the Tories, Neil Kinnock, got a much higher vote than did Tony Blair, who won his great victory in '97. Young people, especially from the ages of 18 and 26, are becoming more and more cynical about the political system. And this has its dangers. It also has possibilities in finding a different way within these spaces that exist to find ways of being active. But ultimately, sooner or later, whatever the activity, how useful, how important on a micro level, unless ultimately it reaches a stage where it is going to try and improve the state in which people live, this deep alienation and depression from traditional politics will not go away. I'll end on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tariq, for this talk. It's another bomb thrown in the face of the myth of capitalism and democracy. And I'm sure our guests have questions and comments. I would first please ask you to kindly make your questions short, precise, and to the point. And then we will take, I think, a round of questions. How would you like this to go? One by one? 2 or 3 questions, and then you respond. And then we take another round of questions. We still have time. So we have Walid, Dalia, and Amr first. Yeah. Can anybody pass the microphone, please? Walid, first.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing your fear. Let me assure you we're very fearful too. I'm quite interested in what you mentioned about Western media, and I want to go back to that example you gave of the woman who dreamt of bin Laden. And I'm very, very interested in that concept of policing thought. You know, it's not just action, it's actually thought, and the creation of enemies, whether there is any root for that in lived reality or not. I mean, the US has had its moment of creating an enemy during George W. Bush's reign. Egypt is having its moment, both evoke McCarthyism, etc., etc. I'm just asking from a larger perspective, looking at the larger picture, are there specific historical factors that would foster this kind of culture and attitude? How would you combat them? And what is the role of the people? Because it seems also that, I mean, I can see from a power perspective how that kind of culture can be serving I mean, whoever agent creates it. But when people kowtow to that, and when people take it for granted, and people play along with it, you know, what does that say about the people? And you know what I mean.
Again, thank you very much for that talk. It was very enjoyable. I just wanted to know whether you had a particular perspective on the coming elections and the fact that a lot of people are refraining from voting because they think that the elections is going to be like a big farce. And people saying that what's the point of giving our votes to Hamdin Sabahi because Sisi's win is inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one question related to your talk, and my question is, you kind of presented capitalism and democracy as somehow separate phenomena. So, and you gave two examples, the rise of capitalism and the decline of democracy now, and the other example was that capitalism as the biggest, China as the biggest capitalist system in the world doesn't enjoy a democratic system. So my question is, should we regard them as two separate phenomena that have developed in Europe or developed in Europe at the same time, or should we think of them rather as somehow related phenomena like the rise of the bourgeois individual and the capitalist which led to the democratic system, but then there was some kind of a dialectical reversal at one point in time which led to the rise of capitalism and the control of economy by a group of capitalists, which led to the decline of democratic rights of individuals by this firm grip of capitalists. So if it is so, I mean, if we don't regard them as separate phenomena, but rather as related phenomena with a dialectical reversal, when did this dialectical reversal take place in history, and how did it take place? Thank you very much.
I'll take these three first. I'll take three at a time. Okay,
We'll take another round of questions.
Yeah.
And not now.
First, Waleed's point. Sorry. First, to answer the question of Waleed about the policing of thought and all the different things associated with it. I think that there is inherent in the capitalist system an authoritarian streak. I mean, if you want to take the most extreme version of capitalism, it was fascism in Europe. Don't think that the economic system, even though the state was powerful, was dominated just by the state. If you look at the profits made by the largest German firms, Krupp's, Thyssen, many others, their profits under fascism leapt from 80% to 300% to 400%, because they could now make money in an open way with slave labor supplied by the Untermensch, the lower peoples from the prisoners of the Slav lands, etc. And there were no trade union rights left in Germany at all. Mussolini's was virtually the same. Lots of Italian capitalists prospered at the time. So this idea that somehow fascism was an aberration, well, it was an aberration, but it was a necessary aberration for them, because they thought unless we do this and establish an open dictatorship, we're going to have a revolution. And a revolution led by Bolsheviks, communists, socialists, left socialists, and which will crush everything. So better do it before they can do it, we do it. And that's what they did, effectively. And then, we saw the results of that. They were not satisfied with doing it. And German imperialism, because that's what it was in this vicious, violent form, said we want, why should we are the largest power in Europe? Look at the French, this is their size. Look at the British, even smaller, and they have large empires. So why shouldn't we have one? I mean, from their point of view, not an illogical question, and a question not simply posed by German Nazis, but also by the German elite historically, back to the First World War. One reason for that war. So all these questions indicate that within capitalism there is a very strong authoritarian streak, and it will do whatever it deems necessary to defend itself. And I think that this question becomes linked in the United States with preserving its hegemony as the world's only real imperial power, a global imperial power, which has never ever existed in the history of the world before. Such dominance by a single state. The European powers, as I indicated, were fighting each other for this world hegemony. And the British came closest to achieving it, but they were never alone. There were the French, there were the Belgians carrying out some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century in Africa. There were the Germans. There were smaller imperial powers from Europe too. But never have we had the situation that we confront today. And one important thing to understand about this is that this is only maintainable, sustainable, if they have the support of their population. In my opinion, no foreign military power can defeat the United States, full stop. I mean, anyone attempts it, they will be crushed. So despite the setbacks they suffer, militarily they are totally dominant. But this military domination is sustained by the fact that their population, by and large, sometimes they get angry like on Vietnam and on Iraq, but by and large sustain the United States as an imperial power. So how this population is kept in line is not an unimportant question for them. And, in private think tanks, they do discuss it. The thing which I noticed, and which didn't surprise me, but sort of saddened me, was the dream in Britain is, a case of sort of excessive bureaucracy gone mad. She was released because there was such a huge protest. But the fact that it could be done was horrific. But what happened in the United States after these two Chechen Americans let off a bomb in Boston? Okay, so there are two kids who leave their thing. The whole city is closed down and their citizens accept it, and every single household is looking, helping, etc. That is quite frightening. And I really felt as it was taking place that this was an experiment in city control, not against, two foolish kids who do this, but against some larger threat which might arise from within and might challenge the system. So I think they know perfectly well that the system is confronting problems. And if they have to, temporarily or even for a long term, they will ditch traditional democratic rights that we have been associated with and which we take for granted. I mean, Germans took them for granted too during the Weimar Constitution and afterward. Nothing can challenge that, but it was challenged. And, the Germans were no better or worse than any other population in the world, in my opinion. You can't blame the whole German nation. They accepted that. So I think the surveillance, it's getting people used to the idea. There's no huge protests in the United States about the surveillance. The country which reacted the most strongly were the Germans. Why? Because the ideological battles between the two Germanys, the big thing the West German elites used to use, look at us, we don't have the Stasi. The Stasi can spy on every household. We don't have it. But Okay, that was true. But what the domination of the United States is such that they do things that the Stasi could not even have dreamed about. I mean, when they are tapping into the phone of Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, into her private cell phone, which she thinks is sacrosanct, all her conversations are recorded. You know, one wonders what indiscretions were committed. But it made her livid that the transcript of these were lying in the offices of some American intelligence agency. So the German reaction, I was there during that, was very, very strong. Elsewhere, people were angered, you know. The newspapers were shocked, but nothing much happened. And in the United States, of course, questions were asked and the usual bland replies were given. But again, nothing much has happened. And every time this happens, people get used to more and more and more and more. And that I find pretty dangerous, because a conformist media actually engenders and creates conformism in society. You know, that just is a reality. The advantage, because we shouldn't get too depressed, is that for the first time ever, also in humanity, the big advance, if you like, in capitalism over the last 30, 40 years has been the new technology. Computers, the web, which is why they also want to control it, hence the surveillance, so that they can go into any computer in the world they want to or they feel and read the stuff. So it's not safe, but then my theory always is that don't say anything in private you don't want to say in public either, as far as politics is concerned. Say it. So I don't care what they read in my computer, but other people may. Nothing from that point of view is safe, but the ability to communicate. I mean, this we saw during the Arab uprisings and other events. Immediately what is happening in Cairo is transmitted to people all over the world, images, texts, and this, the speed with which knowledge is transferred, is an important thing that we have. Even if they're surveilling, they would have to stop it. They would have to close down the system, which they tried to do here, but didn't totally work. But, you know, that's what they're thinking about. How, if we have to stop citizens from communicating with each other, do we have an emergency where we can switch everything off, the big switch? And they will find it. I mean, you know, they do it in some countries already. The computer is allergic to certain words and your system can go dead. So I think they will find a way, but at least we have something. You know, it is a new weapon and we should see it as that, as something positive, which we never had before. The boycott in Egypt. Look, a boycott is making a political statement. It's not just simply staying at home. It's saying, no, we won't participate. My personal opinion, and many of my friends in Cairo disagree with me, I would boycott in this next election. It's settled. There's no surprise in store. You have two effective candidates. I mean, if you want to feel, if you're feeling sort of sentimental, you can go and vote for Sabahi. But fine, no, I mean it, I'm not joking. I mean, even if it makes you feel good, feel better, but there's no real contest. I mean, when one candidate supported, the other candidates take over. And he's now standing because the military needs another candidate, otherwise it would be a joke. So my basic instinctive reaction when people ask me is, I wouldn't. Why bother, you know? It's a done deal. It's done. You walk around the streets of Cairo and, you know, the celebrations are already on the walls in the new iconography, which is coming up. And I've been pleading with my publisher to buy me a pair of underpants with the image so I can, some good memento to take back. So on that, I'm not normally in favor of boycotts because I think one should vote. But you know, what can you vote for? I mean, I didn't vote in the a number of elections in Britain when Blair was in power. I didn't want to vote Conservative. I couldn't vote for Blair. I didn't vote. I mean, if there had been some Green or someone half decent, I would have voted for them just to give them an extra vote. But when they weren't there, then I didn't vote. And increasingly, you know, this is the way many people feel. To the third question, yeah, they are disparate. I mean, it's not totally accidental that both capitalism and democracy were born in Europe. I mean, that's a fact. We know it. That's how the system, the economic system of capitalism emerged in Europe, born directly out of the pores of the feudal system, which had existed. Feudalism in Europe created its own parcelized sovereignties. And these sovereignties gave the possibility of the establishment of city-states, or states which extended beyond the city, with the countryside run by the few. And in the battle against feudalism of the urban populations, you saw the creation of a new bourgeois order with a revolutionary bourgeoisie. But do not forget that two revolutions played a part in this, inspired by the thinkers of the Enlightenment, who had many virtues as well as some vices. This was the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I mean, Jefferson and Voltaire, effectively. And it was these two big mass upheavals that gave a tremendous fillip to thinking about citizen participation. In Britain, you had huge movements too, not on that scale, but that they went to a revolution. The British elite, always more intelligent than some of its European peers, made the concessions earlier, brought in the Reform Acts in the 1830s, slowly increasing the franchise, giving some concessions, but not all, enough to diffuse a movement. But they are disparate in the sense of how capitalism is developed. I mean, capitalism now is run by the big banks and the corporations, with a lot of politicians on their payrolls directly or indirectly, or promise jobs the minute they leave politics. It's a revolving door. And this revolving door now is what is putting democracy under threat. I'll tell you an amusing story about, I think 8 or 9 years ago, a friend of mine who was then professor of history at Cambridge, very good historian, was invited to give a talk in China to the think tank of the Chinese Politburo in Beijing. And being a historian of a particular period, he said, well, this is what I'll come and talk about. And they said, no. That is maybe what you want to talk about. We want you to give a lecture to us on how did Britain avoid a revolution in the 19th century. This is what I called, foresight. And he went and they questioned him in great detail and said, so there was no democracy at all. I said, yes, and they were very pleased. Yes. So, the two things really are disparate and becoming more so now. We were lucky. The 20th century, in times to come, will be seen as a period where many advances were made in many different ways. And horrible things happened too, of course. But on some levels, especially in terms of democratic functioning, democratic representation, social and economic advances, etc., we will see, in the future, the future generations will see that. But they will also realize that the economic system is, by that time, in 100 years, who knows what will happen by the end of this century. Whether we have any democracy left at all, or effectively we will be governed technocratically. I mean, the models they have is when a country is in trouble, like in Italy, they appoint a technocrat with absolutely no political ideas at all, just except to carry out the wishes of the banks, and no rapport with any sections of the masses. And when the political parties come to change him and find someone else, they find someone who exactly gives that impression, but is slightly younger, more zappy, can make a good television image. That is what happened in Italy. That is the first government they imposed on Greece. I mean, in the Irish cabinet, in Ireland, which is also under the being observed by the Troika, this was reported in the Irish press. A meeting of the Irish cabinet is taking place, and they say that we are getting a lot of pressure from the culture cuts we have made in the field of culture to remedy these cuts. And so they're discussing in the cabinet, maybe we should give them a bit more. And they say, yes. They're about to vote for it, and someone says, we have to make a phone call to Brussels to get approval first. That's the state now.
I'm trying to keep track of who requested the question first. There was Munira, there was the gentleman in the back, and there was, yes, Mariam. And then I'll take Munira. Please raise your hand if you want a question.
I'm interested in two things that you've mentioned. First, the idea that I think what you said, that political consciousness or political awareness is never progressive, that people kind of, it doesn't move step by step, that there's a kind of a jump start, and then once it reaches the peak, if the needs or the demands of the people are not met, then it plunges again. And my question about that is, a lot of the political scientists have actually tried to read what was happening in Egypt in light of other movements, other uprisings, different historical periods in different parts of the world. And to a great extent, it has not really been a very accurate description of what is happening in the Egyptian scene right now. I guess my question is, don't you think that the sense of empowerment that the people had, at least in those first 18 days when they managed to remove Mubarak, wouldn't this be hard to take away from them? And wouldn't this be in itself an incentive for them to not give up that easily? And my second question has to do again with this also. When you mentioned the boycott of the elections, but wouldn't actually going to the polls today, even though the results are it's an ipso facto sort of, wouldn't this be a way of going about of this raising political consciousness step by step? It's a way of training oneself to kind of participate or take in the political platform that is happening, and forfeiting it would be a way of just giving in to this feeling of I tried it and it didn't work out, so what's the use? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tariq. I'm an old fan and benefited tremendously from your writings and your talks. You rightly mentioned in your speech that terrorism is nothing new. It has existed before. In the 19th century, there was a lot of terrorism in Europe. But it is argued, and my question would be this, do you accept this view that the kind of terrorism that we have today is a global terrorism? It's qualitatively different from the terrorism that we had in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. So because of the qualitative difference between the existing or current form of terrorism, which is global in nature, the authoritarian or non-democratic measures are necessary. In other words, the contemporary authoritarianism is justified in terms of fighting this new form of terrorism, which is very different from the old one. So my question to you would be, what do you accept this narrative, number one? Number two, if you don't accept, what would be your own way of dealing with this form of the global terrorism? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for an inspiring talk. Yes. You spoke of the reduction of social provision in Europe, and then you spoke of about South America. And actually, I'm curious to know your opinion of the model of the welfare state in the Scandinavian countries, like Denmark, for instance. I'd just like to hear from you about this.
The welfare state where?
Yes, the welfare state of the Scandinavian countries, like in Denmark. And my second question is, it actually regarding the boycott. Don't you think that people voting for Sabahi would be able later on to form something like, it would be like a seed for an opposition coalition that might be, yes, a seed for resisting what will happen later, or resisting the policies of the state later on? Thank you.
Say the last bit again, I didn't quite understand.
Don't you think that voting for Sabahi, you said that you would boycott, and you think that because it's a farce, so maybe the suitable response for this farce is boycotting the elections. And my question is, don't you think that voting for Sabahi might lead in the future for building something like a coalition, an opposition coalition against what Sisi and the state after him, behind him, would propose? Thank you.
So we have 3 questions, and
No,
we
more
have
than
time.
3. We have 5 questions.
From 3 persons. So.
I think 2 of
Yeah, go ahead, please.
2 of the questions were linked. The first one about political consciousness. Sorry. 2 of the questions were linked. The first one about the rise and fall of political consciousness, and the boycott, and your question. So I'll take those 2 together. Yeah, look, the demand of the demonstrators was, we want the downfall of the regime. And the regime is more than a single person. A regime is the entire network of which sustained that particular person in power. So if we want to make a balance sheet, okay, symbolically it was a huge triumph of getting rid of Mubarak. But the structures that maintained him, and I'm now talking about the political structures, not the socio-economic, that's a separate question, are still in place. That's unfortunately is a fact, and they will be used again. So it's 50-50. But certainly the bringing down of the hated despot was a huge triumph, and to be honest, the impact of that in the minds of people, we did it once, we can do it again if necessary, is difficult at this moment to work out, how they will feel about that. But certainly that gave people an enormous self-confidence. You know, it's a feeling that you can move mountains. To what extent that remains when they go through subsequent experiences is an open question. I don't know the answer, because it's very difficult to work it out till something else happens or doesn't happen. That's when we will get a real answer to that particular question. Look, the boycott, it's my personal position. I don't ask anyone else to do it. I just say that's my feeling. Maybe I'm old and cynical now. But, you know, I'm not saying you shouldn't vote. If you want to go and vote just to do it, do it. And maybe you're right. There are no absolutes in these tactical matters. It's a tactical question. Whether to boycott, it's not just an abstention from politics, it's a statement about politics. A boycott always is that. Like occasionally when regimes, not in Egypt I'm talking about now, in other parts of the world, have a referendum. And there's no side of the referendum you can support. So you stay at home saying this is a bogus referendum, it doesn't ask the real questions. So you take a political position and says we are boycotting this referendum and our aim is to have more people not voting than voting. That will be a statement. Here I don't think that's achievable. I have no doubt that there'll be, you know, even with token opposition, that there'll be a huge majority for the incumbent. And it's the next time which becomes more interesting then. It's the next time which becomes more interesting in determining what one should do and what shouldn't do. And then, of course, there's the related question of how much real liberty will be permitted to form a coalition of parties to put up a real challenge. And again here, I don't know the answer to that. The way in which the Brotherhood has been eliminated from its political space, I mean, I have no agreements with the Brotherhood on anything, but that I do find disturbing because it establishes a precedent for doing the same to other people. And so many people who participated in the uprising then decided they were wrong to participate because it was a plot or whatever, now are backing the general very openly and are backing the measures against, are being short-sighted because these, once you agree to this being done to one opposition group, it can easily be done against you. These are some lessons that we should learn from history. So that's my view on the boycott, you know. Terrorism, new and old. Look, you know, terrorism, what is it effectively? It is usually a small group of people. Their numbers are often very small in comparison to those of political parties. Sometimes political parties decide to carry out acts of terror, as is the case in liberation struggles or anti-colonial struggles. I mean, there were huge groups of terrorists in the Punjab and Bengal in the struggle against the British who were not supported by the Congress Party or the Muslim League, but were tolerated because they used these actions for their own purposes, saying to the British, you better get out. If you don't get out, we won't be able to control the situation much longer. Or, you know, many, many other things like that that happened. The question is, you have to ask, who are these people? You know, what are they demanding? This notion that a person who carries out a terrorist act is automatically beyond the pale is a very stupid way of operating, because it refuses then to answer what has provoked this person to become that. Is it justified or not justified? That is what I try to answer in my book, Clash of Fundamentalisms. And look, during the Second World War, and just before it, a young militant in France assassinated the German, a young Jewish militant in France assassinated the German ambassador. The Germans denounced this as an act of terrorism and said it was unacceptable. They were, I mean, it was an act of terrorism, but was it unacceptable given what we know what happened? It was the first act of resistance against the policies that were being implemented. And some people wrote in favor of him, though all the states had said, you know, this is intolerable behavior. Some individuals said, no, this was completely justified. The Russian Decembrists who blew up one Tsar and came close to killing another said, we are doing this because you have left us no other way to act. We will not live under despotism any longer. It's not a most efficient method of getting rid of people. A mass movement has no substitutes, really, for that. But it's a way of making a big splash. And, you know, Lenin once described it in his very provocative fashion. He said, a terrorist is a liberal with a bomb. Why a liberal? Because they believe in pressure politics. You put pressure, 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 and the regime will crumble. It doesn't work like that. He said a terrorist is actually believing that by this single act of terror, he can bring down, or he or she can bring down the regime, but it doesn't work like that. So he was very staunchly opposed to that for political reasons, but never attacked the Decembrists. Or, he said he understood the causes why. And these kids, unfortunate, terrible business in London in July the 7th. I'm fed up of talking about 9/11. I've written about it. But these young kids from Yorkshire who did that business on the tubes, I wrote an article in The Guardian the following day saying to try and understand their motives is not to defend what they did. There's a huge difference between the two. I don't defend what they did, but I wanted to find out why. And in my opinion, this is linked to British foreign policy. It's got nothing much to do with religion as such, even though the kids happen to be Muslims. And of course, when the story came out, one of their friends who was captured by the Italian police and didn't participate in it, but knew about it. So the British sent out a warrant. He was captured. But before he was returned to Britain, he spoke to the Italian secret services very openly, and this being Italy, the next day it was in the national press. And what he said was, what do you think we were doing watching the war in Iraq? Hiding in little rooms and reading the Quran? No, we don't need to read it, we know it. What we were doing was watching videos from Fallujah, where such horrific atrocities were committed by the Americans on the people of that city, that he said all of them, in order to get themselves revved up to do what they did, watch the documentaries from Fallujah. Now, think about that. What causes young people to completely lose it and carry out these attacks is not totally unrelated to US policies in the region and in different countries. So one has to do that. One has to say it's not effective. But for it to say that is to understand why it happens. But for the United States and its allies or vassal states in the world to use this as a total excuse to cut off protest, to stop people from participating in legitimate protests and saying this is that's not acceptable at all, because most people don't believe in these types of activities in any case. And there the danger lies, that this has become now a huge business, really. I mean, on the one hand, the only useful thing about it is that it's employing lots of people. I mean, there are 3 people employed outside the British Council here to check our bags, which I'm glad because it gives employment. And so the security industry has employed large numbers of people who would otherwise be unemployed. This is a single case of where some good has come out of it, but I can't see any other. And quite honestly, the funniest thing is I was in Sana'a in the Yemen, where the hotel Taj Mahal in Sana'a had this security, so I very dutifully put my spectacles and my wallet in the case, whereas the Yemenis were going through with daggers in their belts and, big weapons and just going through, ping, 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 and the security guard smiling and sending them on. So I said, do you mind if the next time I just keep my spectacles? They said, no, it's not a problem. So there are various kinds of security guards, but they are at least employed. But it's ideologically that this whole question is now out of control, really, where it gives intelligence agencies the right to do whatever they want and spy on you. That's unacceptable. Welfare state. What did you ask me about the welfare state? Okay, well, look, the welfare, I mean, I said in my talk that the welfare state is totally under threat. It's been under threat in our part of the world, or in countries like here. I mean, one of the first things done by Sadat was slowly the dismantling of that. And exactly the same thing happened in Pakistan in the 80s. That you dismantle the small state that exists to protect people. The conditions of education and health are abysmal for ordinary people. And then they either depend on parties. In many cases, in Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, elsewhere, it's Islamist parties who then take on the task of providing some basic things for people. I remember I came to Egypt on one of my trips in 2002 or 3, I can't remember, and I met a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who's a doctor in his offices here. All I wanted to ask, I said, you know, this was before the Iraq war, now I place it. And I said, are you guys going to do anything if the Americans go into Iraq? And he said, don't worry, brother, the gates of hell will open. I said, well, I don't want anything like that, but you know, we do need big demonstrations in the Arab world because we're preparing them elsewhere in the world. It's bad if nothing happens. Don't worry about that, he said. Well, that wasn't very convincing, but in any case, I asked him about other things. I said, he said, look, we have the Doctors Association affiliated to our party. How do you think that is? Because we send these doctors into some of the poorest communities, and not just in Cairo, but in the country, especially the countryside. We don't say to them, look, this is who we are. They know who we are. And we provide them with basic necessities of life, which they don't have, and we only do it on a very small level. We can't compete, you know, we are not the state. And the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan does exactly the same. Salafist groups in Indonesia do exactly the same. So the point I'm making is that when the state abandons this task, it creates a huge vacuum in which political parties, and you know, why not, go in and do it, and that is one reason for their popularity. Don't underestimate that. So that is effectively what has happened. And, you know, the South Americans began to reverse it because Chavez said in Venezuela, we are going to use the oil wealth of this country, which is huge, to build hospitals, schools, universities, to provide these things free to those sections of our people who have never, ever tasted them. And that is the reason for their popularity. That they did this, they're doing it in Ecuador, they're doing it to a certain extent in Bolivia. This elementary thing which we once used to take for granted in the last century can no longer be taken for granted. It's regarded as subversive. If you read details of what is happening in the health services of Europe, they are under similar pressures. Do you know who the largest donor to the World Health Organization is? After the states who provide money, the largest donor is Bill Gates. This is the World Health Organization. And with Bill Gates, it's not just a donor, comes the entire paraphernalia of global capitalism. And the pharmaceuticals, who are, even as we speak, fighting a big war for more monopolies and more domination, etc. And the one big mistake the European social democratic states made after the Second World War, especially in Britain, but not just, is that with a national health service, they should have created a nationalized pharmaceutical industry, which did not produce medicine for profit, but for need. It was perfectly possible. It's happened, it was done all over Eastern Europe. It still functions in Cuba, to a certain extent in Brazil, to a certain extent even in India. They produce their medicines. Why? Because it's the only way they can do it. It could be done, but it would mean challenging the power of capital, which they're not prepared to do. And this was a huge, huge mistake, which could have gone through on the nod had they so decided in the last century.
requests for 5 more questions, but I really should apologize to all of you because we are a half hour behind our schedule. So I'm very sorry for those who requested the questions. We have a coffee break now, and then there will be time to discuss things with Tariq during the coffee break and also during the day. Thank you very much once again, Tariq, for an enlightening talk, and we will meet in a half hour.